Alright you guys, so as you can see, I'm back with part 2 of this story, and before I get into the rest of this video, let me just say something real quick. So I'm pretty sure that there are some of you that have been waiting for the second part of this video to come out. I think I dropped the first part about a month ago. The only reason why I didn't put out the second part is because the video didn't generate a lot of interest. At any rate, some of you have been asking me to finish what I started, so that's what I'm gonna do. Unfortunately, because of the time that's lapsed, you guys might have to go back and watch part 1 again, but either way, this is the second part of the video. So as I was saying at the end of part 1, although the media ran several reports on this incident, none of the intricate details were released insofar as what time this incident happened and how many times the victim was shot. So with that in mind, Bandit continued his interrogation on Cheetah, and he asked him if he thought he might have left any evidence behind at the scene, such as fingerprints, DNA evidence, or anything like that. But Cheetah said that when he knocked on the window, he used the back of his knuckle, and that he used the sleeve of his shirt to pull over his hand when he opened up Yellow's car door. So as far as he was concerned, he thought they should be good. However, the only thing that Cheetah said that there might be some concern about is the possibility that one of them might have left shoe prints behind in the mud, and that somebody might have dropped a sack of D. Other than that, there was only 3 people that knew about what happened. So after they talked about Yellow's homicide, Cheetah then starts talking about another homicide that he was involved in at a donut shop on Holt Avenue. Cheetah said that he was the one that shot this guy, but that he took off running, so he had to walk him down and shoot him a couple more times. Furthermore, he went on to say that when they were a couple of blocks away from the donut shop, him and his homeboy Speizel seen a couple of Africanos and shot them as well. At that point, Cheetah had pretty much already sunk himself, and his homeboy Speizel as well. But the intricate details that he would offer up next not only pinned him down, but would also solidify his involvement in the second homicide as well. So he went on to say that the night that this incident took place, that he was wearing a hoodie, but that he was more concerned about the video surveillance cameras possibly recording images of his tattoos. And if you guys remember, the detectives weren't too optimistic about the video surveillance cameras being functional. But to their surprise, they actually worked. And this wasn't grainy footage. They were able to see a guy wearing a hoodie, and the footage was actually clear. When this homicide occurred, the only information that they made public was that the detectives captured images of a suspect running away from the scene. It was basic information. They didn't indicate what he was wearing or anything like that. So once again, Cheetah provided critical details and information about the incident that only someone who was directly involved could have known about. So the following morning, after Bandit has these conversations with Cheetah, he gets word to the homicide detectives that they need to furnish him with a recording device as soon as possible, due to the fact that Cheetah divulged information about several homicides that he claimed he was involved in. Initially, the detectives didn't want to take a chance of giving Bandit a recording device, due to the fact that they felt like his safety and the possibility of his cover being blown clearly outweighed the potential risk and liability that was involved. But based on this information, they had a change of heart. So with the intentions to expedite this plan, the detectives pulled Cheetah out and they approached him to see if he was willing to be interviewed. They honestly had no expectation of him agreeing to talk to them. They knew he wasn't going to talk. There was nothing in it for him, but they still had to try. And the whole purpose for them pulling him out in the first place was to give them an opportunity to set Bandit up with a recording device. So the following morning on January 13, 2014, Bandit was given a recording device while Cheetah was pulled out for this interview. So you guys also got to keep in mind that Bandit had been an informant for a while at that point. He knew all the tricks of the trade, and he knew how to make himself look not suspicious. He was a chameleon. When Cheetah came back to the cell, Bandit just didn't jump straight back into the conversation. He eased him into it. He knew how to make himself look inconspicuous. Like I said, this guy was a natural. So without making it look obvious, Bandit was basically able to get Cheetah to repeat everything he had said the night before for the purpose of this recording. You know, I don't want to get off track, but this is a good example of why you don't talk about things that you were involved in with people that don't need to know. You know, if you got a co-defendant or a homeboy that you were out there committing dirt with and you end up in the county jail, and you just feel like bragging or boasting about crimes that you were involved in, burying yourself or sinking yourself is one thing. But when you start implicating other people and you start dropping names, whether it was done with malice or not, that's when you're going to get yourself in trouble. There was no other reason or purpose for Cheetah to be talking about the details of these homicides other than to impress Bandit. Those kinds of things are to be kept on a need-to-know basis. Even in a situation where you're working on an appeal or you have somebody helping you with your legal problems, you never implicate your co-defendant or yourself in any kind of crimes that you were involved in. You always talk about it as if you were innocent. But anyways, as a result of this Perkins operation and other corroborating information that the investigators were able to gather, Speizel was arrested on February 7th, 2014. So Speizel hits the county jail, and 2 days later, on February 9th, 2014, they put him in Bandit's cell. So as part of their plan, the day that Speizel was arrested, they ended up moving Cheetah out of Bandit's cell. And 2 days later, on February 9th, 2014, they ended up moving Speizel in with Bandit. So later on in the case, when Bandit would end up testifying, he claimed that his initial interaction with Speizel was cordial and friendly, and that at first, when Speizel moved in the cell with him, he didn't even know that Speizel and Cheetah were connected. Bandit claimed that he put 2 and 2 together after this guy introduced himself as Speizel and told Bandit where he was from. So instead of waiting to see if Bandit could get Speizel to implicate himself the same way that Cheetah did, the detectives pulled Speizel out to see if he'd agree to be interviewed. And while the investigators pulled Speizel out to see if he'd agree to be interviewed, they also pulled Bandit out and gave him a recording device. So once Speizel came back to the cell, again, Bandit, he goes through all the motions and he tries to ease him into the conversation. But Speizel, he doesn't take the bait. So he tells Bandit that he doesn't know what they're talking about, that this must be a case of mistaken identity, and that they must be talking about someone else. You know, and keep in mind that because Bandit had been doing this for a while, he was well aware of what his role was. He knew that these detectives put this guy in his cell so that he could get him to implicate himself. And at that point, when Bandit seen that this guy wasn't going to talk, he figured, you know what, I got nothing else to lose. Let me ramp up the pressure and let me try something else. And that's what he did. So Bandit tells Speizel, he's like, hey homie, I don't know why you feel like you need to lie to me about it. He's like, what do you think, I'm the cops or something? He's like, I already talked to your boy Cheetah. He told me how everything went down. I know you were there. I know you were involved. And then he continues to press him, saying, well, why are you lying? Are you a cop? Speizel, on the other hand, caught completely off guard, says, well, I don't know. Following this interaction, they ended up taking Bandit and moving him out of Speizel's cell. So during the time when all this was going on, Cheetah and Speizel both made several incriminating phone calls from the jail. And here's the thing. I don't know how many times I've told you guys this before in the past, but whenever you make a call from a county jail or a prison, there's an admonishment at the beginning of the call that clearly warns you that this call is being monitored and recorded. Yet it's almost like these admonishments are either completely ignored or they're not taken seriously. Because despite being warned, some of these guys will still talk like it's nobody's business. You know, Speizel at least made a futile attempt to circumvent some of his conversations by using a loose-knit code to describe other people he was making references to. For example, he would either refer to Cheetah as his son, Cactus, Stutterbox, or Sally's sister's boyfriend. He referred to a high-ranking 12th Street gang member named Pedro Gonzalez, who they called Jekyll, as Jekyll. But in the big scheme of things, it was pointless and redundant, because if the person on the other end of the line could decipher what he was talking about, then the people that were monitoring and listening to the call, they could figure it out as well. So on February 8, 2014, a day before they put Speizel in Bandit's cell, Speizel calls his wife Esther and he directs her to contact Junior for the purpose of relaying a message to Cactus, referring to Cheetah. So the message verbatim was to make sure the fool was alright and to see what was going on with him. He was basically checking his temperature. So then he goes on to advise his wife Esther that he's got keep away status in the jail and that he believed that they were trying to keep him away from Cheetah. You know, from that point on, these guys then continued to make the same kind of mistakes that we all tend to make when we end up in these same types of situations. The need to find out what's going on, who's where, who's doing what, and overall just how bad things are sometimes cause you to make mistakes and lose sight of your better judgment. And because of this, almost all these types of gang-related cases, whether it's a RICO indictment, a gang-related homicide, or a case with multiple defendants, it always seems like there's always a boatload of recorded phone calls. Recorded phone calls are always a critical part of the case, and it's because people talk openly on the phone. And nobody ever seems to learn from this or capitalize off the last man's mistakes. You know, they're always listening, so it's rare that you'll have a case like this where there's no recorded phone calls that don't end up coming out in discovery. And these guys were no exception. They made the same mistakes. So here's a brief gist of just some of the phone calls that they made on February 8, 2014 that were used against them. So at 10:26 p.m., Cheetah called his girl Patricia Mascarenas, who advised him that his boy Junior had called and wanted to know if she could set up a three-way phone call between them. And then at 10:43 p.m., Speizel called his wife Esther again and asked her if she took care of what he asked, if she talked to Junior. She responded by acknowledging that she did talk to Cheetah and that he was in the men's central jail. At 10:57 p.m., Cheetah calls this girl a second time, and it's during this call that things take a turn for the worse. She ends up telling Cheetah that Speizel's in jail, and when Cheetah hears this, he gets upset. He asks her, well, for which one, the first one or the second one? You need to find out. Anyone listening to this call would be able to figure out the context of what he's talking about. He's either talking about homicides or bodies. And I'm sure that any good lawyer would be able to spin it up different. But when you hear something like that, at least that's the direction that it points you in. So his girl, she ends up telling Cheetah that she doesn't know whether it's the first one or the second one, but that they haven't forgot about you in there and that everything's going to be okay. But Cheetah, on the other hand, didn't sound like he was putting a lot of faith in that, and he kept telling this girl that he needed to get in contact with Junior. When you're in a situation like this and you start stressing out about the possibility of things happening, things that might not have even happened yet, you got to stay focused and keep your mind strong. Otherwise, you'll start thinking into things too much, and this can be detrimental. So on February 9, 2014 at 1:32 p.m., Speizel calls Junior and stresses to Junior that he wants him to get in touch with Cheetah and to tell Cheetah that he's not tripping and that they haven't forgot about him. I don't know what Speizel meant when he kept saying we haven't forgot about you, but if that was some kind of coded message, whatever he was saying, he made a point to make sure that Cheetah got that message. So later that same day, the homicide detectives that were investigating Yellow's homicide, they pulled Speizel out of his cell and they told him that they believed he was involved. And they more than likely did this after listening to the context of some of his recent calls, believing that he was going off the deep end, that he was stressed out, and that he was extremely worried about what was going on with his boy Cheetah. So at 7:32 p.m., Speizel calls Junior and asks him several more times to contact Cheetah. Speizel then tells Junior to ask Cheetah what the fuck you been up to, man, and tell that motherfucker what's up. It was obvious that at this point, Speizel was stressed out the game. I don't know if he felt something in his gut, if he heard something, but he was obviously concerned about what Cheetah was doing. And based on the context of his next phone call, it was obvious that he was starting to figure out what was going on. So Speizel called Junior again at 8:28 p.m. after they had moved Bandit out of his cell, and he tells Junior to tell Cheetah that this guy Bandit, he knew his real name, and this guy knew a lot of shit. As you can tell by what Speizel's saying in that last phone call, his mind was definitely working, and at that point, he needed some reassurances. Because as far as he knows, Cheetah's discussing the details of this case, and this is something that he was definitely concerned about. I'm not trying to get off track, but again, I want to make this point. If there was ever a worst case scenario or a worst time to ever discuss the details of your case, it's definitely when you're incarcerated and you're around other people that are trying to figure out a way to get their freedom back. Like I said earlier, a lot of the times there's individuals that will discuss the details of their case and implicate themselves for no other purpose other than to brag about it, because they simply just want the attention of telling someone else what they did or what they were involved in. Speizel had every reason to be concerned. Granted, him and Cheetah were both involved in this crime, and they both stood to lose a lot if the wrong person ever heard about it. But keep in mind, Speizel was an actual trigger man, so just imagine how he was feeling. The first thing he's going to start thinking is, what if Cheetah does decide to flip? The one advantage that he has to his favor is that Cheetah was involved, but he wasn't the one that actually pulled the trigger. So it's understandable how Speizel probably feels exposed and vulnerable being in the position that he's in. So trip out on this. Whether you choose to believe this is on each one of you individually. But personally, I don't buy that this was all done in good faith and that the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing until after the fact. You guys tell me what you think. So after Speizel talked to Junior and told him to tell Cheetah that this guy Bandit knew him by name and that he knew a lot of shit, from that point on, a chain of events started happening. First, out of nowhere, Speizel was released from custody unexpectedly on February 11th, 2014. That same day, Bandit was taken to court where he made an open plea in his pending case. The judge told him that he was looking at 17 years, 4 months if he pleaded guilty. A few months later, Bandit was placed on probation for 5 years with a 6-year suspended state prison sentence. So for the work that he did on this case, the law enforcement officers that he worked with wrote letters of recommendation on his behalf. He claims that he didn't know that they were going to do that until after he made those recordings. Again, I personally don't believe this myself, but you guys are free to draw your own conclusions. According to the detectives that he worked with, they claimed that Bandit didn't receive nothing more for his testimony. They also claimed that he knew that participating in these types of operations was extremely dangerous because he was well aware of the fact that working against the Mexican Mafia all but guaranteed him a death sentence if he ever went back to prison. So on February 12, 2014, Cheetah called Junior, who put Speizel on the phone. So Speizel tells Cheetah that these ninjas can't hold me back. But Cheetah tells Speizel that he's spooked and he's worried about how these people are getting all this information. Speizel then tells Cheetah that they're making up stories, they're lying, they're throwing out false propaganda. They're telling so many different stories, they had me convinced. So then Speizel tells Cheetah that him and Bandit have been placed in a cell together. And Cheetah responds by saying, "Oh shit." But then Speizel tells Cheetah that this guy said that you made statements about me. So at the end of their conversation, this is what Speizel tells Cheetah verbatim. "You better watch your characters," and that Detective Freeman said that we were going to get hit with the death penalty and that you were going to flip and watch. He was telling me, watch. No, then Speizel says that he told the detective that he knew Cheetah didn't do no dumb shit like he was saying that he did. He was trying to reassure Cheetah that he was keeping the faith in him, but his phone calls and the context of the things that he was telling his boy Junior say otherwise. So in another call, it's obvious that Cheetah had been thinking because he tells Speizel that I'll take everything, I'll take the whole case. And I believe that he was saying this behind the debacle that he created from telling Bandit the things that he did. And that he was probably even worried about this potentially having an adverse effect on his status. And it could have. There's no explanation that he could have gave that would have justified talking about the specifics of their case and implicating his co-defendant. I guarantee you that if Speizel would have took that up the chain, that Cheetah would have been in hot water. But then things ended up taking a turn for the worse. On February 25, 2014, a search warrant was served on Speizel's house in Fontana. Police seized clothing and 44 pairs of tennis shoes. So on the day of Speizel's arrest, he ended up making an incriminating statement that would end up coming back to hurt him later on at trial. Speizel says something to the effect of, "Those could have been anybody's prints in the mud," and then he stopped himself mid-sentence. As soon as he started to say it mid-sentence, halfway through, he realized that he had made a bad mistake. The statement was incriminating, especially based on the fact that he was describing details of the crime that hadn't been divulged to the public. And the two detectives that were present knew that he had messed up too, because as soon as he said it, they just looked at each other. Because again, they had not discussed shoe prints or the condition of the ground at the scene of Yellow's homicide with Speizel, or with anyone else for that matter. So again, later on, when Detective Freeman accused Speizel of being involved in Yellow's homicide, Speizel didn't say nothing. He just sat there. The only thing that Speizel seemed to be concerned about was that they confiscated 2 pairs of his son's shoes and he wanted them returned. And when Speizel approached one of the detectives about this, the detective said that he would make sure that those shoes got processed as soon as he could. But as a favor, he asked Speizel if he wouldn't come back to Pomona and murk anyone else. And Speizel said, okay, he wouldn't. And later on, they would actually use that statement against Speizel, claiming that it was self-incriminating. So the forensic results identified Cheetah as a possible contributor of DNA on the interior door handle of Yellow's car. Speizel, on the other hand, was excluded. A Los Angeles Sheriff's Department criminologist, Christina Fritz, later testified that some of Speizel's shoes shared a class characteristic with impressions left in the wet soil. To dumb it down, which basically meant that he couldn't be excluded, despite the fact that similar shoes could be included as possible sources. So forensics also did a search on Speizel's computer, and his computer showed that between February 4th and February 6th, Speizel did multiple searches on shootings in Pomona and Air Jordan tennis shoes. And according to the detectives, the Pomona police distributed a press release, but that they didn't provide any details about the homicide other than somebody had been shot in the torso. So the jury also watched the video of the donut shop shooting for the limited purpose of trying to decide whether it corroborated statements that were attributed to Cheetah. So in December of 2015, 2 deputies that were assigned to investigate gang activity in the LA County Jail searched Speizel's cell, where they found 2 pages of rosters that were on a shelf behind Speizel's bed. A roster basically includes each active gang member's name, their identifying information, their hood. It might also have his jail number, his AKA, his neighborhood, and his next court date. So according to the roster that Speizel had, his moniker was listed as Speizel and his neighborhood was listed as the Pomona 12th Street Sharkies. Another Pomona police detective, Andrew Baban, testified as a gang expert. And he testified that some of the primary Sureño gangs in Pomona were the Pomona 12th Street Sharkies, Cherryville Pomona, Happytown Pomona, and Westside Pomona. He also explained that there are also many Black Blood and Crip affiliated gangs as well, and that many of these gangs no longer claim the specific territory. So Baban opined that Speizel was a 12th Street gang member based on his personal knowledge of Speizel, Speizel's gang tattoos, gang-related and social relationships, and statements to other gang members in jailhouse phone calls. He explained that a snitch is someone that gives information to law enforcement, and that if someone's found out to be an informant, that the consequences are usually fatal, resulting in someone being beaten or murked. So at Speizel's preliminary hearing, one of the detectives that testified, a detective named Iwig, acknowledged that he mistakenly identified a telephone number that had called Speizel's phone at 4 a.m. after Yellow was murked as Cheetah's. Cheetah's cell number was 909-568-3088, but the number that called Speizel's phone was 909-568-8088. The number was traced to a burner phone bought by JoJo using a fake address. Whether it was just coincidence or not, Speizel has a cousin whose moniker's name's JoJo, but he was in custody at the time that this happened. So Detective Iwig sent the recording of Bandit's conversation with Cheetah to the FBI, and the FBI was able to buffer some of the background noise, but unlike television, not all the extraneous noise disappeared. And a portion of the recording of Cheetah's conversation with Bandit was played for the jury. And the trial court instructed the jury that the transcript was merely an effort to report what is heard, and that the jury is to be governed by the recording itself. You know, it's crazy how courts will give juries information in a case like this. They'll tell them to review it, but then they'll tell them to disregard it and that it can only be used for a certain part of the case. Almost like these guys can be programmed like hard drives, like computers. When you hear something, it's kind of hard to unhear it. Or when you know about something, it's kind of hard not to take that into consideration when you're trying to decide someone's guilt or innocence. Needless to say, in the end, Speizel was held to stand trial for the homicide of Yellow, possession of a firearm by convicted felon, and gang allegations. The trial court rendered a judgment of 80 years to life in state prison based on the sentencing laws that were in effect at that time, and the court's discretion for imposing individual 186.22 gang enhancements for each count. Before I close this up, I want to reiterate on a couple things that I think are important for us all to remember. And I'm bringing these things to your guys' attention not because I think some of you are headed to prison, but just because I think it's important to know about these types of things so that it can be applied to similar situations. You know, I'm sure we all want to be recognized for some of our accomplishments, our accolades, and some of the things that we achieve in life, be it big or small. We want all our props and our recognition for the things that we have done. But when it comes to criminal activity, things you've done in the field or in the trenches, just keep in mind that nothing good will ever come from you bragging or boasting about it to other people, especially in a custodial environment, an environment like the county jail or prison. In fact, these are probably some of the worst places that you could do it, because you got people in there trying to find a way to get back. People who would do anything to get their freedom back. And here's something else to think about. If you're someone who just can't resist putting your business out there, telling other people about things that you've been involved in, implicating yourself in crimes, and you're in the business of placing that kind of trust in people that you don't know, then at the end of the day, that's your business, because ultimately in the end, you're the one that's going to suffer the consequences. But if you have a crimey or a co-defendant, then the rules obviously change. For the sake of this story, here's a hypothetical example. Say one of you and your boys out there on the streets end up catching a body together. A couple of months later, you end up in the county jail in a cell with someone that you end up clicking with. And then while you guys are in there talking about war stories and things that you've been involved in on the streets, you start exposing the details of this homicide that you were involved in, and you implicate your crimey by identifying them. Then later on, this individual goes to the cops and he tells them everything that you told him, because he's now trying to get consideration on another criminal case that he's facing. If something like this happens and your boy ends up getting snatched up and arrested based on the information that you exposed, your so-called career is a wrap. that's comparable to you exposing that case yourself. And that's exactly how the homies are going to look at it. You're going to end up in hot water, and there's nothing you're going to be able to say to justify that. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys liked this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and tell me what you think. And again, something else that's important that I'm going to continue to keep reminding you guys about is to not only hit the like, drop a comment, and share the video, but also hit the all symbol on the notification bell so that you're advised anytime I drop content on this channel. So with that being said, as always, I just want to thank those of you who continue to show your unwavering support and also for continuing to tap into this channel. In the meantime, you guys enjoy the rest of your day. Keep pushing that positivity. And until the next one, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.